Hey guys, with another one-take review, and today I want to talk about the Dave Brubeck Quartet's album Jazz Impressions of Japan. Released in 1964, Jazz Impressions of Japan is a bit of an oddity and very underappreciated within the Dave Brubeck Quartet's massive catalog. When I first discovered this album a few months back, I was immediately enticed by its title alone. Hearing the entity, though not the same lineup, but the very group that was responsible for absolute classics of cool jazz mixed with a tiny bit of post-bop like Time Out, doing a sort of Eastern music-influenced album was very interesting to me. And that's not just to mention the fact that who could really resist hearing one of the true greats of the piano mingling with Japanese musical influences? It's just something that seems to be set up to be great. If what I just said sounds interesting to you or is making you want to check this album out in any way, then you're going to be severely disappointed, like I sort of was, actually, because Jazz Impressions of Japan, minus its title, takes pretty much no actual influence from not only Japanese music, but any Asian music in general. If I'm being honest, the closest that you actually get to direct referencing to Japanese music or culture is song titles like Osaka Blues or Fujiyama, but beyond that, musically and compositionally, there is pretty much no Asian influence to be found here throughout the record. Rather, Jazz Impressions of Japan was actually created based around a tour of Japan rather than Japan itself and its history, culture, and music. This record is through and through Western Hemisphere jazz. It ultimately acts as a snapshot of how Western jazz has impacted Eastern jazz rather than the other way around, which is something that seems very heavily implied by the album title and makes for a maybe slightly disappointing album overall. I'm not saying that the title implies that this is going to be a good album, but at the same time it does imply a basic concept, and it completely fails to even begin to execute that. And while it may seem like a fairly minor complaint, it does make it a bit of a frustrating record when the reason that you checked it out isn't even a major factor in its entire runtime. From this perspective, Jazz Impressions of Japan is a album with creative shortcomings. An Eastern-influenced Dave Brubeck Quartet album could have yielded some really fascinating results had the four-piece combined Japanese or Eastern-influenced in general jazz music with their own sense of oddball cool jazz, time signature changes and all. It could have been a very interesting album, and it's a prospect that feels slightly wasted exclusively on the album title and nowhere on the music. For as many records as Brubeck and his many cohorts over the years released, they never really dabbled much farther beyond their base concepts and their basic genre. There are maybe a couple times where Brubeck got a little fusiony here or there on collaborative efforts, but when it was just the straight Dave Brubeck Quartet, it was mainly just this. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I am actually a major Dave Brubeck fan, and I care for his music quite a bit, but at the same time, there is a looming sense of wasted potential here that devastatingly haunts the record. Jazz Impressions of Japan is also much more musically tame than a lot of other more famous Dave Brubeck albums. While Brubeck and whoever was happening to fill the remaining 3 slots of his quartet at whatever time period had always been kind of considered very notoriously relaxed musicians up until this point, I believe that it's Jazz Impressions of Japan that really shows to the fullest how incredibly laid back and mellow they can be musically. However, it takes it a step farther than albums like Time Out. Instead of those kind of interesting compositional changes and time signature switch-ups that made previous albums so very unique and different, they're kind of just completely thrown out the window, and this is just straightforward cool jazz with a couple of more bop-based numbers throughout. However, as much of a disaster as that may seem like, along with a misleading title, it ultimately works out for the quartet. While Jazz Impressions of Japan may not be the typical jazz geek's favorite album because of its lack of technical uniqueness, I still think that this simplicity makes for something that's very accessible and easy to enjoy without it being the thinking man's jazz or anything like that. Plus, a sense of structural simplicity doesn't necessarily mean that Jazz Impressions of Japan is inherently poorly performed. In fact, as far as instrumentals go, Dave Brubeck and Friends' work here is actually very strong. As you might expect from the fact that this is the Dave Brubeck Quartet and not the insert other musician here quartet, Brubeck is the person that hogs most of the spotlight. I mean, his piano work is absolutely amazing, and he is rightfully remembered as one of the true legends of his instrument as he leads the band through a journey through Japan heart first in his performance, and it really sees him kind of maybe just let loose a little bit. And I mean, there's always been a sense of maybe a little bit of chaos behind Brubeck's performance, but he really just has emotion come before compositional intelligence here, which may seem like an insult, but it's not, trust me. However, alto saxophonist Paul Desmond, as well as drummer Joe Morello, are also very notable performers here. Morello's drum work in particular is actually very noteworthy, as it does have a very essential but subtle place throughout Jazz Impressions of Japan, as it ends up ultimately leading its very cool and chilled out progression. Morello's Thunder Roll-esque drumming intro to The City of Crying ultimately leads up to a more upbeat and a little more lively of a number that results in it being easily the best song on the album, and what may be the very centerpiece of Jazz Impressions of Japan, while essentially proving that the Dave Brubeck Quartet was much more than just one of jazz's favorite piano players and three other revolving musicians. Overall, Jazz Impressions of Japan's title leaves a lot left to be desired here. The concept of a Japanese or generally Asian-influenced Dave Brubeck album is something that deeply interests me and I find to be a very worthwhile concept, but the fact that it just simply doesn't exist kind of eats away at me, especially knowing that he decided to title an album Jazz Impressions of Japan. Even still, if you can get past the wasted potential that comes with arguable false advertising, Jazz Impressions of Japan is an album that is expertly executed and is pretty much perfectly performed. There isn't a single note misplaced here, there isn't a moment of unrequired dissonance or anything like that, even if it is maybe a bit different from what the fan of the more casual, surface-level Dave Brubeck catalog will expect. It's a little bit less odd. It's a little bit less quirky with the time signatures. It's just cool jazz completely played straight. And while that may not be for everybody, especially those in the more technical side of the genre, I know there are a lot of people that aren't really able to dig into this style as much as something that would be on the album Time Out, which I've mentioned several times now. I personally love it, and I'm going to give it 4 stars out of 5. I would consider maybe bumping it up half a star, but man, do I really, really want that Japan-influenced Dave Brubeck album, but unfortunately that cannot happen. So yeah, 4 stars out of 5, and it's a great listen. And with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.